The story begins in a forgotten corner of Savannah, Georgia, nearly 2 centuries ago. In 1978, during renovations at the city's old courthouse, archivist Margaret Langley discovered a set of bound ledgers hidden beneath a false floor. In a forgotten cabinet, the documents had survived decades of water damage, their leather bindings warped, but intact, preserving the ink notations inside. At first glance, the ledgers appeared ordinary, inventories of cotton crops, lists of property transactions, and mundane records of everyday plantation life. But Langley noticed something unusual. Interspersed among the routine entries were meticulous notes written in striking red ink. Dated between 1831 and 1834, these entries described a phenomenon that defied logic. They recounted the lives of enslaved children born entirely in America who spoke not only English, but another language that no one could identify. These were children who had never traveled to Africa, never been formally taught a foreign tongue, yet somehow they possessed fluency in both. The ledgers themselves were unsettling, but attached medical examiner reports pushed the mystery further into the uncanny. 7 children, aged between 4 and 9, had been examined in detail. Each child demonstrated not only the ability to speak and read into distinct languages, but also exhibited behavior patterns that were nothing short of extraordinary. They refused to speak English in certain locations, displayed intense distress when separated from one another, and according to one examiner's notes, appeared to know events and places they could not possibly have encountered. Altogether, the records listed 14 children. 7 underwent examinations. The other 7 vanished without explanation. Officials in Georgia documented the phenomena meticulously, yet after sealing the files, they never publicly addressed them again. It was as if the children and the mystery surrounding them had been deliberately erased from memory. Yet some truths, no matter how deeply buried, never remain hidden entirely. For those who chase the fringes of history, the strange events of Savannah's plantations in the early 1830s remain a puzzle historian cannot explain. In March of 1831, Sarah Whitcomb arrived in Savannah with her husband, Jonathan Whitcomb. A physician from Boston had been appointed county health inspector. The move promised new beginnings. Jonathan was offered a salary far higher than what he could have earned in New England, along with a modest home near the riverfront. Sarah, a meticulous diarist since childhood, carried with her a set of leather-bound journals. She chronicled their journey south and her impressions of Savannah with sharp, unflinching detail. Her entries reveal a city of stark contrasts. Elegant, tree-lined streets and stately townhouses coexisted alongside sprawling plantations, where hundreds of enslaved people labored under brutal conditions. She wrote often of the auctions, where families were torn apart. Children, sometimes no older than 5 or 6, were displayed on wooden blocks, examined and sold as if they were commodities. In an entry from April of that year, she reflected, "I cannot make peace with these customs. Mothers wail in the streets as their children are taken from them. Men shuffle in chains, faces blank with sorrow. How is one meant to grow accustomed to such suffering?" The Whitcomb residence was modest but comfortable. Their narrow home on East Broad Street caught the river breeze through tall windows, and a small garden provided Sarah a semblance of domestic normalcy as she cultivated herbs and vegetables. Jonathan's duties took him frequently to the surrounding plantations. County health inspectors were responsible for documenting disease outbreaks, managing quarantine cases, and assessing the fitness of enslaved laborers, a role Jonathan found morally troubling, but financially necessary, given debts left by his struggling Boston practice. Despite the grim realities he encountered, life in Savannah carried moments of normalcy. The city pulsed with activity. Ships from Europe and the Caribbean unloaded goods and immigrants along the wharves. Theaters hosted performances, churches held lively socials, and society thrived amid the opulence and cruelty of the region. Yet beneath the bustle, a quiet, Eerie tension lingered, a tension that would soon touch the Whitcomb in ways they could never have imagined. The Whitfords arrived in Charleston, South Carolina, in the spring of 1831, welcomed as educated Northerners seeking a new beginning. Yet Sarah Whitford quickly noticed a subtle wariness from the local residents, especially when conversations turned to politics, labor, or the deeply entrenched systems that underpinned the region. The Whitford household employed two enslaved women, Clara and Louisa, both in their 20s and born on plantations outside the city. Clara served as cook and housekeeper. Louisa handled laundry and general chores. Sarah's journals reveal her conflicted feelings. She sympathized with the women, yet could not ignore her role in the system she found morally indefensible. Clara sang this morning, she wrote in April, a song in a language unfamiliar to me. When I asked her about it, she went silent. Her eyes cast down. After some gentle persuasion, she admitted it was a song her grandmother once sang, a language preserved in sound. Though the meaning has been lost, we keep the sounds, she said, even when we do not know their meaning. The sadness in her voice followed me all day. Sarah's husband, Dr. Jonathan Whitford, traveled extensively as a county health inspector, documenting diseases, injuries, and neglect across the plantations. His medical notes, later archived at the New England Historical Society, detail children suffering from rickets, adults with improperly healed fractures, countless cases of fever and dysentery, all the direct consequences of systemic exploitation. While his records were clinical, Sarah's journals capture his private anguish. Jonathan returned home tonight silent. Over a glass of whiskey, he recounted the case of a boy no older than 7, whose arm had been crushed by mill machinery. Infection set in, yet the owner refused amputation. Citing cost, Jonathan performed the surgery regardless. The boy died 3 days later. The coastal region surrounding Charleston held its own peculiarities. The Sea Islands, a string of barrier islands along the coastline, had been farmed for rice and cotton since the early 1700s. Malaria and yellow fever were constant threats. The labor system, often organized under a task-based method, allowed enslaved communities to preserve aspects of their West African heritage, particularly customs and oral traditions from areas now known as Sierra Leone, Senegal, and Angola. But what Sarah Whitford would soon witness was neither tradition nor folklore. What unfolded in the Whitford journals defied every explanation Jonathan or any medical professional could provide. Charleston itself had been built on profits from slavery. By 1831, its port ranked among the busiest in the South for cotton exports. Wealth was visible everywhere. Grand homes along manicured squares, gas lamps lighting major streets, marble banks, and trading houses gleaming in the sun. Yet Sarah recorded the moral cost. We live in houses built with human misery. We eat food prepared by hands that are not free. We walk streets swept by those who have no choice. How long can such a society endure? How long before the weight of it collapses everything? Jonathan's role gave him unprecedented access to plantation operations, auction blocks, where families were torn apart, breeding farms where children were born for sale, punishment yards where resistance met brutality. While his expertise made him indispensable, it also forced him into complicity. Sarah observed his internal conflict. He believes working within the system allows him to save lives, and perhaps it does. But I see the toll it takes on his spirit. He drinks more than he did in Boston. He flinches at sudden sounds. He sleeps poorly. Charleston's society was rigidly hierarchical. At the top, plantation owners and wealthy merchants controlled land and capital. Below them were professionals like Jonathan, reliant on the planter class's patronage. Then small farmers, artisans, and shopkeepers. Free black citizens occupied a precarious existence, legally free yet constantly surveilled. And at the bottom were the enslaved, who, despite often outnumbering whites, Had no rights and no protection. It was into this tense, stratified world that the unexplainable arrived. June 12, 1831, dawned hot and oppressive. Jonathan received a message from Bellamy Plantation. 3 children were exhibiting alarming symptoms: high fevers, confusion, and what the overseer described as speaking in tongues. Sarah insisted on accompanying him, determined to witness firsthand the conditions. Her husband reported. The journey took 3 hours along muddy roads, gradually leaving the city behind. Savannah's orderly streets gave way to cultivated fields, then to wild terrain where massive oaks formed natural tunnels, draped in Spanish moss that swung like silent curtains. By the time the plantation appeared atop a small rise, its size was imposing: a whitewashed brick main house, 3 stories tall, verandas wrapping each level, and fields of cotton, corn, and rice stretching in every direction. Bellamy held nearly 200 enslaved individuals. The slave quarters, to rows of small wooden cabins with mud-chinked walls, housed families in tightly controlled spaces. Children too young for labor played between the buildings, their laughter clashing with the oppressive heat and harsh realities surrounding them. The overseer, Walter Crane, a massive man in his 40s with sun-weathered skin and hands like slabs of iron, led Jonathan to the sick house. They weren't like this yesterday morning, Crane explained. Normal at breakfast, then midday. Suddenly they just stopped working, started speaking. I don't know what language, African. Maybe, but none recognize it. Inside, 3 children sat on rough wooden benches, ages 5 to 8. 2 girls, 1 boy. They were still, their hands folded, eyes fixed on the opposite wall. Yet their mouths moved in perfect, synchronized rhythm, speaking a language Sarah had never heard, a language structured, melodic, and haunting. It was not fevered babble, nor childish nonsense. Their voices blended seamlessly, indistinguishable from one another. Jonathan approached cautiously. Physical checks revealed nothing amiss. Pulse steady, pupils responsive, reflexes normal. Healthy children, yet utterly unreachable. His repeated questions, offers of water and food, even attempts to separate them, failed. Distress rose only when one child was moved away from the group. Then, a breakthrough. Standing before the oldest girl, blocking her view of the wall, Jonathan spoke. Can you hear me? If you understand English, respond. For the first time, the unified speech faltered. The girl, Rebecca, paused. Then, in flawless, unaccented English, we hear you. We understand you. We are here. Her words were flat, precise. When asked how she had learned the other language, she answered simply, no one taught us. We already knew. We carry it inside. We are vessels for what came before. Then, as suddenly as she had spoken English, she resumed the unknown language, perfectly synchronized with the others. Sarah's journal captures the moment. Whatever they are saying, they understand it fully. Rebecca's eyes showed clarity, awareness beyond her years. Not madness, not illness, something else. Something no one here can explain. Over the next hours, Jonathan consulted medical texts, considering fever, hysteria, or group delusion. None matched. The children were healthy, alert, coordinated, and fluent in a language utterly unknown to anyone present. That evening, Sarah spoke privately with Clara and Louisa. They hesitated, but eventually admitted stories had circulated for generations, children speaking languages they could not have learned, remembering events beyond their experience. Memory survives, Clara whispered. You can take away our freedom, our names, our families, but not what we remember. Sometimes, those memories speak through those who listen. Sarah closed her journal that night, her mind heavy with the realization. The children were not simply sick, not simply traumatized. They were vessels carriers of knowledge, memory, and language that stretched far beyond their brief, confined lives. The conversation with Clara haunted Sarah Whitford for days. She filled her journal with reflections, struggling to comprehend what the enslaved woman had suggested. Memory is tangible, Sarah wrote, something that can survive and pass through generations, even when those who first experienced it are gone. But memory is supposed to be personal, individual. We remember our own lives, not those of our ancestors. What if there are forms of memory we don't yet understand? What if trauma, especially trauma endured collectively, leaves a mark and imprint that persists beyond those who suffered it directly? Dr. Jonathan Whitford dismissed the idea as unscientific. Memory, he insisted, is biological, rooted in the brain. Knowledge could only be transmitted through teaching, learning, or repetition. What Sarah described implied a spiritual or supernatural mechanism, and such things, Jonathan argued, did not exist. But Sarah had seen Rebecca's eyes. She had heard the children speak a language no one could identify. She could not shake the sense that something extraordinary, beyond ordinary medical science, was unfolding. Over the following weeks, similar reports arrived from other plantations in the region. The pattern was consistent: enslaved children, ages 4 to 9, entering trance-like states and speaking to languages English and the same unknown tongue Jonathan had first encountered at Bellamy Plantation. These children were all born in America from separate families, yet each exhibited the same remarkable behaviors. The second incident occurred on June 19th at Riverbend Plantation, 12 miles west of Charleston. 2 boys, aged 7 and 8, were tending a vegetable garden when they suddenly sat down in the dirt, speaking in the mysterious language. The overseer had tried shaking them, shouting, even threatening punishment, but the children remained motionless, uttering the synchronized sounds for 6 hours, until their mother persuaded him to summon Dr. Whitford. By the time Jonathan arrived, the boys had been moved to a storage shed. They sat side by side on the earthen floor, voices perfectly synchronized. Physical examination revealed nothing abnormal: no fever, no injury, no signs of illness. When Jonathan asked questions in English, the older boy answered. His voice was flat, distant, chilling in its calmness. "We see what happened here," he said. "We see those who came before us. We remember." "Remember what?" Jonathan pressed. "Everything." The boy replied, "The ships, the markets, the beatings, the ones who died, the ones who lived but wished they hadn't. We carry their memories. We speak their words." Jonathan protested. The children were too young to know such things. They were not alive when these events occurred. The boy interrupted. "We died and came back. We came back so someone would remember, so someone would speak." Then he returned to the unknown language, leaving Jonathan shaken and Sarah deeply unsettled. Chapter 4. A Growing Mystery. June 24th. A third incident unfolded at Thornton Fields, a cotton plantation southeast of Charleston. For children, ages 4 to 8, were found standing in the cotton fields at dawn, arranged in a circle, speaking the same synchronized language. Their overseer reported that they had possibly remained outside all night. Recognizing the value of Sarah's observations, Jonathan brought her along. The children were now seated in the plantation chapel, a small wooden structure for compulsory Sunday services. Every few minutes, the unified speech paused, and one child spoke in English. "We walked for days, and the sun burned our skin," one voice said. "They put chains around our necks. The water was too salty to drink. My mother's name was lost." Each fragment delivered in a flat, detached tone, recounted experiences the children could not possibly have lived. Sarah recorded every syllable, noting the rhythm and melodic structure of the unknown language. Later, when a brief lull allowed the youngest girl to respond directly, Sarah asked gently, "Do you know where you are right now?" The girl looked around, confused. "I was somewhere else," she said, "on a boat. It was dark, crowded. People were crying. Then I was standing in a line, and people were looking at my teeth. Then I was here." "Do you remember those things happening to you?" Sarah asked. "They didn't happen to me. They happened before, but I remember them like they happened to me. I don't know how. When it happens, it feels real, like I'm living it. And the words, they just come. I don't choose them. They're just there. By July, local plantation owners were in panic. Rumors spread quickly among landowners and overseers. Children speaking an unknown language were considered disturbed and could not be sold at full value. Several affected children were moved to isolated locations to prevent disruption in the quarters. Jonathan meticulously documented each case. Sarah accompanied him to every plantation, noting behavioral patterns, rhythm, and phrasing across 6 plantations. 14 children were identified. All were located within 20 miles of Charleston, along the Wando River. All were born to unrelated families, arriving decades apart from different African regions. Yet the language was identical. Jonathan used written phonetics to transcribe the unknown speech, filling dozens of pages. When consulted, scholars at the Charleston Medical Society could not identify the language. Some suggested religious ecstasy. Others theorized neurological disorders or deliberate deception. A linguist in Charleston proposed it might be a Creole language. Yet the fluency and perfect unison defied gradual development. Dr. Samuel Whitmore of Harvard provided a striking observation. Elements of the language resembled several West African families, particularly the Mandan Bantu groups, but also contained sounds and patterns unknown to any contemporary African dialect. It is as if the language has evolved over centuries, Dr. Whitmore wrote, or perhaps it is a memory of something ancient, preserved in the children themselves. The behavioral patterns were equally unsettling. Children entered trances in perfect synchronization, spoke knowledge of distant events, and demonstrated memories of experiences they could not possibly have lived. The phenomenon defied rational explanation, leaving Sarah and Jonathan both horrified and fascinated. Each child, when seized by the trance, fell into a state unlike anything the Whitfords or anyone else had ever witnessed. Hours, sometimes days, passed with no interruption. During these periods, the children spoke a language no adult could understand. They accepted food and water when offered, but ordinary play and interaction vanished. They ignored siblings, abandoned work, and resisted comfort or punishment. Then, as abruptly as it began, the trance ended. The children returned to normal laughing, working, speaking English, yet they claimed to have no memory of what had transpired. Sarah Whitford, however, discovered something different. Through patient, discreet conversations with the children always away from overseers and the watchful eyes of plantation owners, she learned that the children did, in fact, remember. They simply could not speak of it openly without fear or risk of slipping back into the trance. Several children spoke of recurring dreams that preceded their episodes. One young girl described it to Sarah in quiet tones. "Every night the same dream," she said. "A place surrounded by water, with tall stone buildings, and people dressed in white. Someone teaches us words. So many words. They put the words inside us." Double quotes another child, a boy, spoke of seeing those who had come before. "They show us things," he explained, "things that happened long ago, things that hurt. They want us to remember. They say if we don't remember, it didn't happen, and if it didn't happen, they died for nothing." When Sarah asked him to elaborate, his voice dropped to a whisper. "Chains, dark places, water that goes on forever, people falling, so many people falling." Jonathan Whitford, ever the physician, remained skeptical. Children under trauma often conjured elaborate fantasies as a means of coping. The dreams, he argued, were understandable extensions of their daily suffering. But the language, the identical, structured language shared by 14 children across different plantations, he could not explain. There must be a rational explanation, he insisted. There always is. Sarah, however, could not dismiss what she had seen and heard. She continued her careful interviews, slowly building trust with the children. One encounter, in particular, stayed with her for decades. It was with an 8-year-old boy named Daniel from Fairfield Plantation. Daniel had undergone 3 trance episodes, each lasting day, during a lucid period. Sarah sat with him in the shade of a sprawling oak, while Jonathan attended to other children nearby. "Do you want to tell me what it's like?" Sarah asked gently. Daniel was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke. "It's like being many people at once. I'm me, but I'm also them. The ones who came before. I can feel what they felt. I can see what they saw. And the language." Sarah asked. "It just comes," he said. "It's like it was always there, waiting for me to find it. Sometimes it scares me. Sometimes it feels good. Like I'm not alone. Like I'm part of something bigger." His gaze dropped to his hands. "Other times, I remember things that hurt so much I can't breathe. Things done to people like me. Things that shouldn't happen to anyone. I want to scream, but the words come out in the other language, and I can't make it stop." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. She reached for him, trying to offer comfort, gesturing helplessly at the plantation around them, unable to convey the enormity of the horror surrounding these children. Daniel's eyes, ancient in their calm, met hers. "You don't have to be sorry, Miss Sarah. You didn't put us here. But maybe you can help people understand. Maybe you can write it down, so people know. We remember so it's not forgotten. Maybe you can remember too." The conversation would linger in Sarah's mind for the rest of her life. Decades later, in journals written during the Civil War, she reflected on Daniel's words. "He gave me a task," she wrote in 1862. "A task I am still trying to fulfill. To remember, to bear witness, to ensure that what happened is not forgotten. But how does one remember atrocities one never saw? How does one testify to suffering one did not personally endure?" And yet, that is exactly what these children were doing, remembering what they had never lived, bearing witness to suffering they had never personally known. Perhaps memory is not just our own experiences, but the accumulated experiences of all who came before us. By August, what had begun as a medical curiosity had grown into a potential crisis. Plantation owners demanded answers. Some threatened legal action against Jonathan, claiming his examinations had triggered or worsened the trances. Others whispered that he was secretly abolitionist, manipulating the children under the guise of medicine. Tension ran high at the Charleston Medical Society, where colleagues were split. Some supported his investigations, while others urged him to abandon the matter entirely. A visiting physician from Charleston, Dr. Lawrence Bennett, a specialist in nervous disorders, was scheduled to examine 7 of the 14 children on August 20th. Yet before the examinations could take place, the unthinkable occurred, for children vanished overnight from August 15th to 16th, 1831. Rebecca from Bellamy Plantation, the girl who had first spoken English to Jonathan Daniel from Fairfield, and to siblings Jacob and Mary from Riverside, disappeared. The quarters were locked, windows narrow, doors bolted, yet somehow the children escaped without a sound, leaving no trace behind. Rebecca's mother awoke to an empty sleeping mat, initially assuming the child had risen early. When she failed to return, panic spread. Within hours, similar reports emerged from the other plantations. Patrols mounted on horseback scoured fields, forests, and roads. Bloodhounds from Brunswick traced scents that twisted and turned, ultimately stopping in mid-air, as if the children had passed through solid matter. That evening, Jonathan was summoned by Sheriff Hiram Cobb, a large, imposing man with a red face and restless hands. "You visited every plantation where these incidents occurred," Cobb said, suspicion in every word. "You've examined these children, spoken with them privately. Maybe you know more than you're saying. Maybe you've been planting ideas in their heads." "Sheriff," Jonathan replied, barely containing his anger, "I am a physician. My job is to examine and care for patients, not to orchestrate escapes. I have documented every visit, every observation, every examination in detailed records. You may review them if you wish for the next hour. Jonathan laid out his meticulous notes, correspondence, and Sarah's journal entries, providing the sheriff with a complete account of events. Sarah herself provided an alibi for the night of the disappearances, her calm testimony reinforcing the extraordinary reality of what had occurred. By the time the evening shadows fell over Charleston County, Dr. Nathaniel Hawthorne and his assistant, Miss Clara Whitfield, had retired to their modest home. Nathaniel complained of a lingering headache, a remnant of the relentless days spent observing the children. Clara, meticulous and precise, recorded in her journal that their housemaid, Mabel, had served supper promptly and had heard Nathaniel working in his study until nearly 10 o'clock. Yet the peace of the evening could not dissolve the unease lingering in both their minds. Sheriff Elias Carver arrived that night, his presence formal but laced with suspicion. The children's disappearance had stirred a wave of panic across 3 plantations, and Carver's questions cut straight to the heart of the mystery. "If it wasn't you," he said, voice firm, "then who?" Locked quarters don't simply yield children into thin air. Somebody planned this. Somebody helped them. Hawthorne suggested the possibility of assistance from other enslaved people, trusted peers, who might have risked punishment to aid the children, but investigations produced nothing. No one spoke. Fear, Clara noted, had silenced the very witnesses who might have had answers. Plantation owners murmured of organized abolitionist plots, whispers of Quaker families and free black communities, or merchants from the North sympathetic to anti-slavery causes. Committees were formed, accusations were cast, yet no concrete proof surfaced. But Clara noticed anomalies that didn't fit the escape narrative. During her quiet interviews at the plantations, she spoke with individuals in the children's quarters, those who had lived and labored beside them. Their recollections shared a haunting consistency. "I heard nothing that night," one woman from Oak Ridge Plantation told Clara. "The silence was unnatural," she insisted. "No snoring, no crying infants, not even the skittering of mice in the walls. It was like the world had stopped breathing," she said. Others spoke of an unshakable sense of foreboding, a weight pressing upon her body, compelling her to remain still. "It wasn't fear exactly," she said. "It was more like being told to wait, to not look, to let it unfold." And then there was Joseph, a young field hand on Fairfield Plantation, who had ventured outside briefly despite the night curfew. He described an encounter he could scarcely comprehend. Daniel, one of the missing children, walking toward the woods not alone, but accompanied by shadowy figures, indistinct, human-like shapes that seemed to guide him. Daniel whispered the unknown language. Joseph insisted, in conversation with these shadows. "I watched until they reached the tree line," he said, "and then nothing. They simply vanished." Search parties scoured the surrounding countryside for weeks, rewards posted for any information. But the children, Rebecca, Daniel, Jacob, and Mary, were gone, as if erased from the world. Hawthorne, burdened by guilt despite Clara's reassurances, sank into restless nights, drinking heavily and replaying the vanished faces in his mind. By early October, 7 remaining children now under his observation were brought together at the Savannah County Infirmary, a brick building near the waterfront. The infirmary, typically home to indigent patients and sailors recovering from tropical illnesses, was prepared to house the children in 6 small rooms. Hawthorne's authority was absolute. Clara, acting as recorder and unofficial caretaker, ensured they received what comfort she could provide: books, lessons, conversation, and meals. The children: Thomas 8, Rachel 7, Elizabeth 9, James 6, Hannah 5, Samuel 7, and Abigail 4, came from 5 different plantations, their African heritage spanning multiple ethnic groups. They bonded quickly, forming a tightly knit community. When one entered a trance, the others joined in the unknown language, their voices melding into a unified rhythm. As though guided by a collective consciousness, Hawthorne approached the phenomenon as a medical enigma. He tested memory, literacy, and responsiveness, often separating the children only to bring them together again. Noting that proximity seemed to affect the intensity of their episodes, astonishingly, when presented with his transcriptions of the unknown language, carefully phonetic renderings of sounds not found in English, the children read fluently, as if the words were innate, instinctive. "They're inside my head," Thomas said simply. Every child demonstrated similar abilities, and all had no formal education beyond rudimentary commands. They had never held books, nor accessed any structured learning. How could such knowledge exist within them? Hawthorne documented every test, every observation, but even he could not reconcile the facts with contemporary understanding of learning or memory. Clara, working alongside the children, observed a deeper truth. In quiet conversations, she learned that the children were terrified of what they remembered. "Will they hurt us?" Elizabeth asked one evening. "About what, child?" Clara inquired. Elizabeth's voice trembled. "The others. The ones before us. The ships, the markets, the work that kills. We see it all. We remember everything. And we speak the language to tell the stories no one else remembers." The trances shifted in late October, becoming brief yet intense, the children speaking both English and the unknown tongue simultaneously, alternating mid-sentence, revealing vivid experiences of ships, Middle Passage horrors, and auctions, none of which they could have witnessed. Hawthorne attempted rational explanations, absorbed tales, false memories, or imagination. Yet the specificity, the smells, the sensations, the visual details defied all reasonable explanation. Each child recounted separate yet verifiable incidents from history, suggesting a transmission of knowledge far beyond normal experience. Clara theorized what Hawthorne could not yet accept. Perhaps memory was not purely individual, she wrote. Perhaps trauma, carried across generations, imprinted itself in ways science had yet to understand. Epigenetics and intergenerational trauma, discoveries still a century away, might one day explain what she observed. The children, through their shared language, accessed not just stories, but echoes of the past embedded in their being. By November, the children began demonstrating premonitions, predicting visitors, events, and deaths with alarming accuracy, and produced drawings of landscapes, architecture, and people they had never encountered. Some resembled West African coasts and Caribbean attire, verified decades later by anthropologists studying Clara's journals. On November 3rd, all 7 children entered a trance lasting 18 hours. They stood hand in hand, chanting in perfect unison, their movements synchronized as if guided by a single consciousness. Hawthorne attempted to intervene, to separate them, to speak, but they were unreachable. Clara, exhausted but vigilant, recorded the phenomenon, noting patterns, rhythms, and repetitions. By dawn, they collapsed, coherent, hungry, but unharmed. That evening, James requested Clara write down their message. "The ones who left, they want us to come," he said. They spoke of the barrier islands, south of Savannah, the sea islands once home to rice plantations, and the landing points of countless enslaved ancestors. "They're showing us the way," James explained. "So we can remember, so we can tell the story that needs to be told." Hawthorne, initially incredulous, hesitated. "Perhaps taking them there," he admitted, "may help us understand what they're experiencing." Clara's mind raced with concern, yet she recognized the gravity, the necessity, of witnessing what the children were drawn to. Preparations began immediately. Provisions were packed, a small crew assembled, and by dawn on November 10th, the group departed for Obor Island. The journey through coastal marshes and waterways was surreal. Live oaks draped in Spanish moss, herons gliding over channels, alligators sunning on mudbanks. The children watched silently, alert, communicating quietly in English and the unknown tongue, anticipation evident in their expressions. They had reached the threshold of a history few dared remember. and a story the world had long tried to forget. By late October 1831, Dr. Jonathan Reed and his assistant, Margaret Whitmore, were heading toward the ruins of Willow Marsh, an abandoned plantation deep in the marshlands of coastal Georgia. The estate had been deserted decades earlier after a devastating yellow fever epidemic swept through the region, leaving few survivors among both the enslaved population and the plantation family. Attempts to resettle the land had all failed. Recurring illness, infertile soil, and the isolation of the marsh had made it uninhabitable. As the party advanced through tangled thickets and overgrown paths, Reed noticed something remarkable. The children in their charge were leading the way, not following, not hesitating, but moving with uncanny certainty. When the trail split, little Eleanor veered decisively along the right path, and the other children followed without pause. The adults, including Reed, struggled to keep up. "How do you know the way?" Reed called out, catching his breath. "We can feel it," Eleanor replied, her voice calm, her eyes fixed ahead. For 20 minutes they pressed on, through thick underbrush and damp shadows, until a clearing appeared. Sunlight flickering through the remaining trees. The adults froze. Before them lay the remnants of Willow Marsh's slave quarters, small, roofless cabins, walls still streaked with faded whitewash, and brick chimneys jutting like silent sentinels over a carpet of grass and wildflowers. Outlines of garden plots and paths, long abandoned, remained visible, as if the land itself remembered its past. The children halted at the edge of the clearing. They stood motionless, staring at the ruins, and then without prompt or signal they began to speak. It was a language none of the adults had heard before. Not chanting, not rhyme or song, but rapid, overlapping conversation, questions, answers, interjections, a dozen voices speaking through 7 mouths. Margaret recorded the scene in her journal. It was not the children speaking. Their voices were vessels, instruments carrying words from elsewhere, pain, anger, loss so deep it tore at the heart, and then determination, a demand to be heard. Attempts to intervene were futile. The children moved freely among the ruins, touching walls and tracing the old garden paths, speaking continuously in the strange, haunting language for over an hour. Reed observed with a mix of awe and apprehension. A ritual seemed to unfold before them. The children positioned themselves at the ruins, each at a separate structure, forming a rough circle across the clearing. They touched the earth, the walls, and crumbled foundations, marking locations as if acknowledging something vital. The voices intertwined, rising and falling, a tapestry of sound that seemed older than the children themselves. One of the overseers, Thomas Greer, whispered nervously to Margaret, "This isn't natural. We should leave now." "Not yet," she replied, her voice firm but wary. "They need to finish." After more than an hour, the voices softened. Sadness gave way to peace, the speech slowing into measured patterns, more song than conversation. Gradually, each child fell silent, save for Eleanor, whose solo voice lingered for 10 more minutes before fading into profound silence. Even the marsh seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. Then the children collapsed gently into the grass, exhausted but unharmed. Eleanor looked up at Margaret, her young face bearing an old soul's gravity. "We told them," she whispered. "We told the stories. Now they can rest." "Who?" Margaret asked softly. "The ones who died here," Eleanor said. "The nameless, the forgotten. We spoke for them." County official Robert Hensley, present during the episode, stepped forward, anger evident. "This is a trick. Someone has taught these children to perform. It's staged." Margaret, standing protectively, confronted him. "For what purpose, sir? These children have nothing to gain. They've suffered enough without being forced into deceit." Hensley dismissed her protest, invoking the plantation order. "Slaves do not get mysteries, do not get to be extraordinary." His words were cold, casual cruelty masquerading as law. Reed spoke quietly but firmly. "You fail to see them as human beings. This is not a game. It is something we do not yet understand. The official overruled them. Orders were given. The children would be sold, separated across distant plantations to prevent further communication. Within weeks, all 7 were gone, their fates unrecorded. Reed petitioned for investigation, for their safety, but his entreaties were ignored. Colleagues distanced themselves, fearing association with what was called slave mysticism. Reed and Margaret tried to trace the children, sending inquiries across Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama. Most went unanswered. A few returned notes, no longer on this property. Current whereabouts unknown. For children Amelia, Samuel, Isaac, and Clara were never located. Reed privately confessed his doubts in letters. Children so young could not have traversed hostile terrain alone. Something beyond understanding had occurred. Efforts to identify the language continued. Scholars speculated, could it be a form of Creole, remnants of West African tongues, or a deliberately preserved coded language? None could explain the fluency, the synchronized speech, or how children born generations later could speak words of their ancestors. The mystery endured. Margaret's journals reflect her struggle to comprehend. They were vessels for something larger. Memory made manifest, not personal memory, but collective memory, surviving through time. Through silence and suppression. They spoke for the voiceless, remembered the forgotten, kept something alive that should have perished. By early 1832, Reed's practice in Savannah had collapsed. Threatening letters arrived. Stones were thrown through windows. They returned to Massachusetts. Reed abandoning medicine entirely. He died in 1847, unacknowledged for the extraordinary events of his final years. Margaret lived until 1873, preserving her journals, eventually donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society in 1921, lying largely unexamined until rediscovery in the 1960s. The case of the Willow Marsh children remains unsolved. The voices they carried, the stories they told, were a fleeting glimpse into a hidden world, a testament to resilience, memory, and the enduring power of those who had no voice. For a brief moment, the past spoke through children, and the living bore witness. Decades later, the journals of Margaret Whitmore and Dr. Jonathan Reed drew renewed attention from historians and anthropologists studying enslaved communities and acts of cultural resistance. In 1978, Martha Harlow, a county clerk in Savannah, uncovered previously unexamined courthouse records, hidden within a stack of medical reports. She found a single folded page in Reed's careful handwriting, undated, but unmistakably from late 1832 or early 1833. Reed's note was startling. "I have reached a conclusion. I cannot publish, yet cannot ignore. The children were not ill, nor deluded, nor performing. They were recalling not their own memories, but the memories of others, ancestors, perhaps, or those who shared their suffering. The language they spoke was real, preserved through means we do not understand. The knowledge they displayed came from a place of suffering so profound it defies words. A residue of history, a living echo of lives erased." He continued, "I failed them. I treated them as medical curiosities when they were delivering a message. They were giving voice to the nameless, the unremembered, the countless who perished without acknowledgement. For that, they were silenced, scattered. History may forget them, but I will not." Reed's reflections end abruptly. No further documents have been found, and the records reveal nothing about the fates of the 14 children. After 1803, their names vanish from history as though they had never existed. Only Whitmore's journals and Reed's notes survive, fragments of evidence that such events occurred at all. The phenomenon was never reported officially again. If similar incidents occurred elsewhere, they were never recorded. Any linguistic samples Reed collected were lost, destroyed, or buried in archives never meant to be opened. The old Willow Marsh plantation on Oakboro Island remained, abandoned through the 19th century. Archaeological surveys in the 1990s uncovered several unmarked burial sites. containing the remains of dozens of enslaved individuals. Carbon dating placed deaths between the mid-1750s and the early 1800s, many coinciding with the 1790 yellow fever outbreak. None were named. Their stories had disappeared, except for a brief moment in 1831, when children spoke voices that had been silenced generations before. The courthouse records surfaced briefly in a 1979 exhibition on African American history in coastal Georgia, attracting modest interest. Within a year, the documents were returned to storage, filed away in climate-controlled archives where they remain. Harlow, who retired in 1985 after more than 30 years of service, reflected in an interview with the Savannah Chronicle, "I've worked with historical records for decades. I've seen strange things, unsolved mysteries, impossible events documented by reliable witnesses. But these plantation records, there was something different. Not what they said, but what they implied. Lives erased, stories lost, and those children, I keep thinking about them. What became of them? Did they ever speak that language again? Did anyone ever listen? We'll never know, and that haunts me. The children had spoken into languages one taught, one preserved through mysterious, untraceable means. 14 children across 6 plantations demonstrated this phenomenon over several months in 1831. Then it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Official reaction, silence and dispersal. Historical reaction, forgetting. Only Reed's notes and Whitmore's journal survived, buried in archives across the South, waiting to be rediscovered. Modern scholars have attempted to reconstruct what the children experienced. Theories vary. Some suggest coded language as a form of cultural preservation. Others propose collective psychological responses to trauma or dissociative phenomena granting access to ancestral knowledge. Anthropologists point to similar practices among oppressed peoples worldwide, methods to retain history and identity under systematic erasure. Yet none of these theories fully explains what Reed and Whitmore documented: the perfect synchronization of speech, literacy in an unknown language, the predictive utterances, the uncanny connection to historical locations all remain unexplained. Even to centuries later, the mystery persists. Some questions may never have answers. Some truths are too unsettling to confront. But the story is clear. The children of coastal Georgia carried voices of the past, speaking words meant to survive long after attempts at erasure. They preserved language, memory, and identity in ways the world could neither recognize nor control. Whitmore's final journal entry on the case, written in 1865 shortly after the Civil War, captures her enduring reflection. "I cannot help but wonder what became of them. Did they live long lives? Did they ever speak that language again? Did anyone truly listen? Perhaps it does not matter. Perhaps the act of remembering, of giving voice, is enough." For a moment, these children spoke for the forgotten. They proved that some memories survive, even when the world insists on silence. And maybe, just maybe, that is how history keeps its conscience. The 14 children vanished from official records, their names, their voices, their deeds lost to time. Yet in that fleeting window of 1831, they spoke truths that could not be erased. And in the whispers of history, their memory endures. The 7 children we tried to protect, the 4 who vanished, the 3 sold before we could intervene. If they survived, they would now be in their late 30s. They would have lived through a war that finally tore down the chains that bound them. I hope they endured. I hope they discovered freedom and some measure of peace. I hope the extraordinary abilities they revealed in 1831 enriched their lives, rather than bringing them harm. But more than survival, I hope they remembered. I hope they remembered the voices they carried, the words they spoke for the voiceless. That in the midst of despair and oppression, they became vessels for stories that demanded to be told. I hope they knew that at least 2 witnesses, myself and Dr. Jonathan Reed, saw, heard, and believed in them, that we understood the magnitude of what they had done, even when no one else would. I hope that someday, someone will read these journals, these notes, and grasp the significance of what witnessed not merely as a historical curiosity, but as proof of something deeper, that the human capacity for memory, language, and cultural preservation can withstand every force that seeks to erase it. These children proved that some truths endure, some memories refuse to fade, some voices demand to be heard. May their memories be a blessing. May the words they carried echo across generations. May the stories they preserved continue to live, in whatever form, in whatever voices speak them. They deserve to be remembered, all 14 of them, the countless ancestors whose experiences they carried forward, the thousands who perished namelessly on ships, in plantations, and in unmarked graves. Each deserves acknowledgement. And now, after more than 3 decades, I find solace in having recorded what I witnessed. I bore witness. I remembered. Perhaps that is all any of us can do. Remember, bear witness, refuse to forget. Perhaps that is enough. Sarah Whitmore's journals end here. She passed away 8 years later, in 1873, and was laid to rest beside Dr. Reed in Worcester. Her gravestone makes no mention of her time in the South or the children she sought to protect, yet the journals survived, passed down through generations, eventually preserved in historical archives, waiting for anyone willing to confront the full complexity of America's past. The mystery of the children who spoke into languages remains unresolved, but perhaps solving it was never the point. Perhaps the point is simply this: to remember that it happened, to remember that 14 children carried something extraordinary and gave it voice against all odds. To remember that memory itself can be an act of resistance. To remember that some silences can never be fully repaid, only acknowledged. They spoke, we heard. Nearly 2 centuries later, the echoes of their voices still demand attention. They still challenge our assumptions. They insist that we remember what the world tried so hard to bury. And if this story leaves you wondering about the countless histories still hidden in dusty archives, know that there are many more waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe and turn on notifications, and journey with us into the forgotten and the unexplained. If this tale unsettled you the way it unsettled me, share it with someone who values history's hidden truths. Because sometimes, remembering is all that we can do, but sometimes, remembering is enough.